The phone call lasted less than 2 minutes, but after 14 years of silence, 14 years of questions, and 14 years of believing a chapter of their lives had ended forever, those 2 minutes would change everything the Morgan family thought they knew. The woman on the other end introduced herself calmly. "Hi, is this Rebecca Morgan?" Rebecca almost ignored the call. The number was unfamiliar, and she was halfway through grading papers at her kitchen table in Asheville, North Carolina. "Yes, my name is Laura. I work with a veterinary clinic in Amarillo, Texas. This may sound strange, but we recently scanned a dog for a microchip, and your name came up." Rebecca frowned. "A dog?" "Yes, ma'am." For a brief second she thought maybe it was some kind of mistake. Then Laura spoke again. "The dog's registered name is Buddy." Everything in Rebecca's world stopped. The pen slipped from her hand. For years, nobody had spoken that name to her unexpectedly. Not Buddy. Not the golden retriever who had vanished when her children were young. Not the dog they searched for until their voices gave out. Not the dog whose collar still sat in a shoebox in the attic. Not the dog they buried in memory, because they never got the chance to bury him in reality. Rebecca gripped the edge of the table. "That can't be possible." The woman hesitated. "We thought there might be some confusion too, but the microchip registration appears active. The information traces back to your family." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "How old is the dog?" "We estimate around 16. 16. The number hit her harder than the name, because Buddy would have been 16. Exactly 16. Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, memories she had spent years carefully organizing suddenly came rushing back all at once. A muddy golden retriever racing through autumn leaves. A little boy laughing so hard he could barely breathe. A little girl wrapping her arms around warm golden fur. A family that once felt complete. And a summer afternoon that had shattered everything. 14 years earlier, Asheville had been a different place for the Morgans. Rebecca taught 4th grade at a local elementary school. Her husband, Daniel, managed operations for a regional landscaping company. Their son, Ethan, was 10. Their daughter, Sophie, was 8. Life wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable in the ordinary way most families hope for. Soccer practices, school concerts, weekend cookouts, family road trips through the Blue Ridge Mountains. And at the center of nearly every memory was Buddy. The dog had entered their lives as a rescue puppy. Golden fur, oversized paws, a crooked left ear that never fully stood upright. The children instantly loved him. Daniel joked that Buddy had somehow convinced the entire household he was another child. The dog slept beside Ethan's bed during thunderstorms, waited faithfully by the door every afternoon when Rebecca came home from work. Even neighbors knew him. People waved to Buddy during evening walks. Local shop owners kept dog treats behind counters. He wasn't simply a pet. He was woven into the family's daily life so completely that nobody imagined a future without him. Then came July, a hot North Carolina afternoon, the kind where the air felt heavy enough to touch. Daniel was repairing a section of fence behind the house. Rebecca had taken Sophie shopping for school supplies. Ethan was inside playing video games. Buddy was in the backyard. At least that was the plan. Nobody knew exactly what happened. Later, Daniel would replay the day thousands of times. Maybe the gate latch didn't catch properly. Maybe a delivery driver left it open. Maybe Buddy saw something and chased it. Nobody ever figured it out. All they knew was that around 3 o'clock, Ethan looked outside and noticed the yard was empty. At first, nobody panicked. Buddy occasionally wandered to a neighbor's property. Daniel drove around the subdivision. Rebecca called friends. The children searched nearby streets. But by sunset, the uneasiness began. By midnight, fear had replaced uncertainty. By morning, the nightmare had begun. They printed flyers, hundreds of them. Daniel taped posters to utility poles. Rebecca visited shelters. Neighbors organized search groups. Local businesses pinned photographs to bulletin boards. For weeks, every phone call triggered hope. Every sighting led somewhere. And every lead ended in disappointment. Someone thought they saw Buddy near a gas station. Wrong dog. A family reported a golden retriever along Interstate 40. Wrong dog. A truck driver spotted a similar dog outside Knoxville. Wrong dog. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The family adjusted, but they never truly moved on. Loss settled differently inside each of them. Ethan stopped talking about Buddy entirely. Sophie cried whenever she saw golden retrievers. Daniel became obsessed with checking shelter websites late at night. Rebecca carried guilt she never admitted out loud. The guilt of not being home. The guilt of not preventing something she couldn't have prevented. The guilt every parent feels when life changes in ways they cannot control. Time moved forward anyway. Children grew up. Ethan graduated high school, then college. Sophie left for nursing school. The family moved to a different house. Life expanded around the empty space, but the space remained. Every now and then Buddy resurfaced in conversation, usually during holidays, usually after old photographs appeared, always followed by silence, because nobody knew how to finish the story. There was no ending, no answer, no goodbye, only absence. And eventually, after enough years passed, absence became part of the family itself. That was why the phone call felt impossible. After Laura ended the conversation, Rebecca sat alone in her kitchen staring at the rain. Her hands trembled. She wanted to believe it. She was terrified to believe it. 14 years was too long. People disappeared for 14 years. Dogs didn't. Not usually. Not realistically. Not without explanation. A few minutes later, she called Daniel. He answered immediately. Everything okay? Rebecca swallowed. No. The silence that followed felt strangely familiar. What happened? She looked out the window again. 1,000 memories colliding with a single impossible possibility. Then she said the words neither of them ever expected to hear again. Someone found Buddy. And for the first time in 14 years, the story they thought was over suddenly had a new beginning. For several seconds after Rebecca spoke, Daniel said nothing. The connection was still active. She could hear him breathing. Then came a quiet laugh. Not because he found it funny. Because sometimes people laugh when reality suddenly stops making sense. What do you mean someone found Buddy? Rebecca repeated everything she had been told. The veterinary clinic, the microchip, the age estimate, the location in Texas. When she finished, Daniel responded with the same. question that had already been running through her mind. How can that even be possible? Neither of them had an answer. By that evening, the entire Morgan family knew. Ethan was 24 now and living in Charlotte, working as a software developer. Sophie was 22 and finishing her first year as a pediatric nurse. Both received nearly identical phone calls. Both reacted almost exactly the same way. Shock, disbelief, then cautious hope. Are they sure it's him? Ethan asked. We don't know, Rebecca admitted. What if the chip information is wrong? It could be. What if it's another dog? It could be. What if somebody made a mistake? Rebecca paused. It could be. The uncertainty hung over every conversation. Nobody wanted to get hurt again, because that was the problem with hope. Once you've lost something important enough, hope becomes dangerous. That night, Rebecca barely slept. She kept remembering the search, not the happy memories, the difficult ones, the endless driving, the flyers, the false sightings, the emotional exhaustion. She remembered standing in a shelter nearly 14 years earlier, looking through rows of kennels, desperately hoping and dreading she might find him. Every golden-colored dog had made her heart race. Every disappointment left another scar. At some point, she had learned how to stop expecting miracles. Now a miracle appeared to be calling from Texas. The next morning, Laura from the veterinary clinic called again. This time she provided more information. The dog had been brought in by a man named Walter Ramirez. Walter owned a small ranch outside Amarillo. A few weeks earlier, a stray golden retriever had appeared near one of his cattle pastures. The dog was thin, older, friendly, clearly accustomed to people. Walter assumed someone nearby had lost a pet. He posted photos online, contacted local animal groups, checked neighborhood forums. Nobody claimed the dog. Eventually, he took the animal to a veterinarian. That was when they scanned the microchip and found the Morgans. Rebecca listened carefully. One detail immediately bothered her. If he was lost in North Carolina, she asked, how did he end up in Texas? Laura sighed. That's the question nobody can answer. After hanging up, Rebecca sat quietly. The distance alone seemed impossible. Over 1,500 miles. 14 years. Countless unanswered questions. The more information they received, the stranger the story became. Yet something about it felt real. Because nobody was making dramatic claims. Nobody was promising certainty. Everyone involved seemed just as confused as they were. 2 days later, Laura emailed photographs. The entire family gathered on a video call to open them together. Rebecca clicked the first image. Nobody spoke. An old golden retriever stared back at them. Gray fur covered his muzzle. His eyes looked cloudy with age. His body was thinner than they remembered. Time had left its mark, but there was something familiar, something impossible to ignore. Daniel leaned closer to his screen. My God! Sophie covered her mouth. Ethan stared silently. Then Rebecca opened the second photograph. The dog turned slightly sideways, and suddenly Sophie began crying. The crooked ear. It was still there. Not fully bent. Not fully upright. Exactly the way it had always been. Nobody had mentioned the ear. Nobody at the clinic knew about it. Yet there it was. A tiny physical detail preserved through 14 years. For the first time, disbelief started giving way to possibility. Not certainty, but possibility. The family spent hours comparing old photographs, looking for matches, searching for evidence. The shape of the face, the ear, the chest markings, the size, the eyes. Everything seemed to align. Still, there remained one uncomfortable reality. Even if this truly was Buddy, they knew almost nothing about the life he had lived since disappearing. Where had he been? Who had cared for him? Had someone adopted him? Had he wandered for years? Had he crossed state lines with a family? Had he been loved? Or had he spent years surviving alone? Each possible answer carried its own emotions. Rebecca found herself worrying about things she never expected. What if Buddy no longer remembered them? Dogs remembered people, certainly. But 14 years? Almost an entire lifetime. Would he recognize their voices, their faces, their scent? Would the reunion be meaningful, or would it only matter to the humans? Meanwhile, another challenge emerged. Travel. The dog was in Texas. The Morgans were in North Carolina. And despite the emotional urgency, practical life still existed. Work schedules, flights, costs, responsibilities. For 3 days they debated. Then Daniel finally said what everyone was thinking. If there's even a chance it's him, we have to go. Nobody argued. The trip was planned immediately. Rebecca and Daniel would fly first. Ethan would meet them there from Charlotte. Sophie arranged time off from the hospital. The veterinary clinic agreed to help coordinate everything. But before the trip could happen, another unexpected development appeared. Laura called again. This time her voice sounded different, more cautious. There's something you should know. Rebecca felt her stomach tighten. What is it? We spoke with Mr. Ramirez again. Okay. He remembered seeing something unusual. What? Laura hesitated. He thinks the dog may have belonged to another family before, showing up at his ranch. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Apparently Buddy arrived wearing part of an old collar. Rebecca's heart raced. A collar? Yes. Was there a tag? No. Then how does that help? Laura paused. Because Walter remembers seeing a faded piece of stitching. Rebecca waited. He said he could barely read it. Most of the lettering was worn away. What did it say? Laura answered quietly. Not much. Rebecca gripped the phone, but one word was still visible. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Then Laura said it. Buddy. For a moment Rebecca couldn't breathe, because if that was true, it meant something important. Somewhere along the way, someone had known his name. Someone had cared enough to keep a collar on him. Someone had likely loved him. And suddenly a new mystery emerged. Not just where Buddy had been, but whose lives he had touched while he was gone. As departure day approached, the emotional atmosphere inside the Morgan family shifted. Hope grew stronger, but so did fear. The closer they got to answers, the more they realized those answers might not be simple. Because 14 years is a long time. Long enough for children to become adults. Long enough for people to move across the country. Long enough for memories to fade. Long enough for entire lives to unfold. And somewhere inside those missing 14 years was the story of what happened to Buddy. A story none of them knew. A story that was waiting for them in Texas. A story that might finally explain how a beloved family dog vanished from North Carolina and somehow reappeared more than a decade later on the other side of America. But before they could meet Buddy, before they could discover whether he still remembered them, another phone call would arrive, and this call would reveal the first real clue about where he had spent all those missing years. 3 days before the Morgans were scheduled to leave for Texas, Rebecca received another call from Amarillo. This time it wasn't Laura from the veterinary clinic. It was Walter Ramirez, the rancher who had found Buddy. His voice carried the rough warmth of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. "Mrs. Morgan, yes, I figured maybe you'd want to hear directly from me. I appreciate that." Walter paused. "You've been wondering where your dog's been." Rebecca laughed softly. "That might be the understatement of the year." "I can't answer that," Walter said, "but I might have something that helps." Rebecca sat upright. "What kind of something?" "A photograph." Her heart skipped. "A photograph of Buddy?" "Maybe." The uncertainty immediately caught her attention. "What do you mean, maybe?" Walter explained. A few days after discovering the microchip information, he had mentioned the story to a friend who owned a feed store outside Amarillo. The friend had recognized the dog. Not recently. Years ago. The dog had apparently spent time with an older man who lived nearly 80 miles away. The man had died several years earlier. His name was Harold Benson. Walter hadn't thought much of it initially. Then his friend dug through old community event photographs posted online. In one image taken nearly 9 years earlier, a golden retriever appeared beside Harold. The resemblance was striking. Walter emailed the picture while they were still on the phone. Rebecca opened it immediately. The image wasn't particularly clear. It showed a small county fair, a barbecue competition, several local residents standing together, and beside a tall, gray-haired man stood a golden retriever, older than the Buddy she remembered, but unmistakably familiar. The crooked ear, the broad face, the same posture. Rebecca felt tears forming. For the first time, there was evidence that Buddy had actually lived somewhere during those missing years. He hadn't simply vanished into mystery. He had existed. He had been seen. He had mattered to someone. When she forwarded the photograph to the rest of the family, the reactions came quickly. Ethan called within minutes, so he wasn't alone. "No," Rebecca said quietly. "He had a life." That realization affected everyone differently. For years, the family's imagination had filled the empty spaces with worst-case scenarios. Now another possibility emerged. Maybe Buddy hadn't spent 14 years lost. Maybe he'd spent part of those years found. The question was by whom and how. The mystery deepened the following day. Laura contacted them again. After speaking with residents near Harold Benson's former property, she uncovered additional details. Harold had been a widower, a retired truck mechanic, no children, no surviving close relatives. People remembered him mostly because of the dog. Apparently, the golden retriever had accompanied him everywhere. Feed stores, hardware stores, church picnics, county fairs, local diners. Several residents even remembered the dog's name. Not Buddy, Rusty. The information created immediate confusion. If it was Buddy, why call him Rusty? Had Harold renamed him? Did he know the dog's original identity? Or had Buddy somehow arrived without tags or records and simply become rusty over time? Nobody knew. Yet every answer seemed to generate new questions. The closer they got to the truth, the larger the mystery became. 2 mornings later, Rebecca and Daniel boarded their flight. For the first time since the phone call, the situation felt real. No longer a possibility. No longer photographs and conversations. In less than 24 hours, they might actually see Buddy. Daniel spent most of the flight staring out the window. Rebecca could tell he was nervous. Not about traveling. Not about the uncertainty. About disappointment. Neither of them said it directly, but both understood. What if they arrived and realized they were wrong? What if emotion had convinced them of something that wasn't true? What if the dog recognized nobody? The fear lingered quietly between them. When they landed in Amarillo, Ethan had already arrived. Seeing their son brought another reminder of time's passage. The little boy who had searched neighborhoods for Buddy was now a grown man with a career, his own apartment, and responsibilities. Yet the moment he hugged his parents, Rebecca saw the 10-year-old again. The boy who once cried himself to sleep after Buddy disappeared. That evening, the family met Walter Ramirez. The rancher looked exactly as Rebecca imagined. Weathered face, sunburned skin, firm handshake, kind eyes. They sat together at a small barbecue restaurant while Walter shared everything he knew. Unfortunately, it wasn't much. Buddy had simply appeared near his ranch one morning. No tags, no owner, no obvious signs of recent abandonment. Just an elderly golden retriever wandering alone. How long do you think he'd been on his own? Ethan asked. Walter shook his head. Not sure. Could have been days. Could have been weeks. Was he scared? No. Hungry. A little. Friendly? Walter smiled. Friendliest dog I've ever met. That answer somehow comforted everyone. The next morning, they finally visited the veterinary clinic. Rebecca had imagined this moment dozens of times during the trip. Every version felt different. Every version felt impossible. Nothing prepared her for reality. Laura greeted them at the front desk. Then she led them toward a quiet examination room. The hallway seemed longer than it actually was. Each step increased the tension. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The door opened, and there he was, Buddy. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. The dog lay comfortably on a blanket, his muzzle almost entirely gray now, his body thinner, older, slower, yet undeniably familiar. Rebecca felt tears instantly. Daniel stopped walking. Ethan stared. The dog looked up. At first there was no dramatic reaction, no immediate recognition, no movie-style moment. Just an old dog observing unfamiliar visitors. And strangely, that made everything feel more real. Because 14 years had passed, life had happened, time had happened. Buddy blinked, studied them. Then something changed, very subtly. His ears shifted, his posture straightened, his eyes focused. Rebecca whispered his name, Buddy. The dog froze. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Buddy. His tail twitched. Once, then again. Slowly, carefully. as though some deeply buried memory had suddenly stirred awake. Rebecca stepped closer. Tears streamed down her face. The dog stood. His legs looked stiff with age, his movements cautious, but he stood. Then he took 3 slow steps forward. The room remained silent except for quiet crying. Buddy stared directly at Rebecca, then at Daniel, then Ethan. Something seemed to connect. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually. Like old photographs coming back into focus. His tail began moving faster. Rebecca knelt. The dog approached, lowered his head, and pressed it gently against her shoulder. The room broke apart emotionally. Rebecca sobbed. Daniel turned away, wiping tears. Even Laura quietly stepped outside. For several minutes, nobody spoke. They simply held him, touched his fur, looked at him, allowed themselves to believe, because after 14 years, belief still felt difficult. Yet amid the overwhelming emotion, another mystery remained. The biggest mystery of all. How had Buddy traveled from North Carolina to Texas? How had he become Rusty? What happened after he disappeared? And as extraordinary as the reunion already felt, the answers they were about to uncover would reveal a journey none of them could have imagined. Because later that afternoon, a box recovered from Harold Benson's old property would surface. Inside were photographs, receipts, handwritten notes, and one document that would finally begin telling the story of Buddy's missing years. But instead of providing closure, the discovery would open an entirely new chapter of the mystery. By late afternoon, the emotional intensity of seeing Buddy had settled into something quieter. The shock was gone. The disbelief had mostly disappeared. In its place was a strange mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Because, while the reunion itself felt extraordinary, none of the biggest questions had been answered. The Morgans knew Buddy was alive. They knew he had somehow survived. But they still had no idea how 14 years of his life had unfolded. That changed when Laura called them back to the clinic. A woman named Claire Benson had arrived from Oklahoma. She was Harold Benson's niece, not a close relative. In fact, she admitted she had only met Harold a handful of times during her life, but after hearing about the story spreading through local news and social media, she contacted Walter, and she had brought something with her, a cardboard box. The box had been sitting in a storage unit for years. After Harold died, most of his belongings were auctioned, donated, or discarded. Claire had kept only a few personal items. Among them was a box labeled simply, Rusty. The name immediately caught everyone's attention. Inside were dozens of photographs, receipts, veterinary records, old greeting cards, and a collection of handwritten notes. Rebecca carefully picked up the first photograph. Harold sat on a wooden porch swing. Beside him lay Buddy, younger than he appeared now, healthy, comfortable, relaxed. The date printed on the photo stunned everyone. 8 months after Buddy disappeared. Only 8 months. For 14 years, the Morgans had imagined endless possibilities. Yet here was evidence suggesting Buddy had reached Texas less than a year after vanishing. How is that possible? Daniel whispered. Nobody answered. They continued sorting through the contents. Photo after photo revealed pieces of a life. Buddy at county fairs. Buddy sitting beside a fishing pond. Buddy riding in the passenger seat of an old pickup truck. Buddy sleeping near a fireplace. The images were surprisingly ordinary, and somehow that made them emotional, because they weren't looking at a lost dog. They were looking at a dog who had lived, a dog who had experienced birthdays, seasons, road trips, and quiet afternoons. A dog who had become part of another person's family. Then Ethan found a veterinary invoice. The date was especially important. It showed Harold bringing Rusty in for treatment approximately 13 years earlier. The document included a short note from the veterinarian. Owner states dog found near truck stop west of Amarillo. No identification present. Friendly disposition. Estimated age, 2 years. The room grew quiet. This was the first actual clue. Not a theory. Not a guess. A documented fact. Buddy had been found near a truck stop. The location immediately sparked questions. How many truck drivers stop there every day? Ethan asked. Walter shrugged. Hundreds. And back then, probably the same. Rebecca suddenly remembered something. Years earlier, during the original search, one possible sighting had come from a truck driver. At the time, they dismissed it. The lead went nowhere. The location wasn't close enough. The timing didn't match perfectly. But now she wondered, what if Buddy had wandered farther than anyone realized? What if someone picked him up intending to help? What if he traveled across states accidentally? The possibility seemed far more realistic than any dramatic explanation. As they continued examining the contents of the box, another discovery emerged. A small notebook. Most pages contained mundane reminders, feed purchases, vehicle maintenance notes, appointments, but scattered throughout were entries mentioning Rusty. Not every week, not every month, just occasional observations. And through those simple notes, Harold Benton began to emerge as a person. One entry read, Rusty chased a rabbit today. Still thinks he's young. Another said, vet says arthritis is starting. Same as me. A later note simply stated, bad day, missed Margaret. Glad Rusty's here. Rebecca paused. Margaret had been Harold's late wife. The sentence hit her harder than expected, because suddenly the story wasn't only about Buddy. It was about another lonely person whose life had intersected with his. Someone who appeared to have needed the dog as much as the dog needed him. The notebook revealed something else. Harold knew Rusty had belonged to someone before him. One entry made that unmistakably clear. Found him years ago, but sometimes I wonder where he came from. Somebody loved this dog. Rebecca had to stop reading. Tears filled her eyes, because Harold had been right. Somebody had loved him very much. And somewhere in Texas, a man who never met the Morgans had unknowingly protected a piece of their family for over a decade. The following morning brought another breakthrough. Claire remembered something she hadn't initially considered important. Harold had occasionally spoken about the day he found Rusty. Not often, but enough to leave an impression. According to Harold's story, he discovered the dog near a truck stop during a road trip. The animal appeared exhausted, thin, dehydrated, and strangely determined to follow people. Harold assumed someone had recently abandoned him. He asked around. No one claimed ownership. After several days, he brought the dog home. What happened afterward was remarkably simple. The dog stayed. Not because Harold formally adopted him. Not because anyone planned it. The dog simply never left. The more details emerged, the clearer the picture became. Buddy's disappearance may have been less mysterious than everyone imagined. Painful, complicated, extraordinary, but not necessarily mysterious. A young dog escapes from a North Carolina yard, wanders farther than expected, eventually encounters travelers, perhaps receives food from strangers, possibly climbs into a vehicle, perhaps follows people across multiple locations, eventually appears near a busy transportation corridor in Texas, then meets Harold. Not impossible, not magical, just an unlikely chain of events. Yet one major question remained unanswered. Did Buddy remember the Morgans? The reunion had been emotional, but everyone wondered the same thing privately. Had he recognized them? Or had he simply responded to affection? That answer arrived unexpectedly later that day. While sitting outside the veterinary clinic, Ethan pulled out his phone. He found an old video, one recorded when he was 10 years old. The footage showed Buddy chasing a tennis ball through their backyard. The audio quality was poor, the video shaky, but Ethan's childhood voice was clear. "Buddy, come here, boy." The sound echoed from the phone speaker. Immediately, Buddy lifted his head. His ears moved, his eyes focused. Then something remarkable happened. The old dog stood up, walked directly toward Ethan, and placed his head against Ethan's leg. Not once, repeatedly, as if searching for the source of a memory. Everyone watched in stunned silence. Ethan played the clip again. The reaction repeated. This time Buddy's tail moved gently, slowly, deliberately. The moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it felt profound. Because memory exists in different forms. Humans remember through stories, photographs, dates, language. Dogs remember differently, through sounds, patterns, emotions, voices. And for a brief moment, 14 years seemed to disappear. That evening, another difficult reality surfaced. Buddy was old, very old. The veterinary team estimated he was nearing the end of a normal golden retriever lifespan. Nobody knew how much time remained. Months, maybe longer, maybe not. The realization changed everything. Suddenly the story wasn't only about finding him. It was about what happened next. Would he stay in Texas? Return to North Carolina? How would they transport him safely? What choice would be best for the dog? The reunion had answered one question. Now another important decision awaited. And before the family could make it, they would learn something unexpected about Harold Benson's final years, something that would transform their understanding of Buddy's journey and ultimately shape the future of everyone involved. The decision about Buddy should have been simple. After all, the Morgans were his original family. They had spent 14 years wondering what happened to him. Now they had found him. Most people assumed the next step was obvious. Bring him home. But reality was more complicated than that, because during the days that followed, the Morgans learned something that changed how they viewed the entire story. It happened during a visit to Harold Benson's former property. The small ranch house sat beneath a white Texas sky. The paint had faded. The porch boards creaked. The place felt quiet in the particular way homes often do after someone is gone. Claire walked them through the property. She pointed out old photographs still hanging on walls. A workbench Harold had used for years. The chair where he drank coffee every morning. And almost everywhere they looked, there were traces of Buddy. A water bowl near the porch. Scratch marks beside a screen door. Worn patches of grass where a dog had clearly spent countless afternoons. Then Claire showed them something unexpected. A collection of photo albums. Several were dedicated almost entirely to Buddy. The family sat around a dining room table turning pages. Season after season. Year after year. There was Buddy lying beside Harold during football games. Buddy waiting near a fishing dock. Buddy sitting patiently while Harold repaired equipment. Buddy riding beside him in the truck. The photographs told a story words couldn't. Harold hadn't simply owned the dog. He had loved him deeply. As the afternoon continued, Claire shared more details. After Harold's wife died, he became increasingly isolated. Friends moved away. Health issues limited travel. The house grew quieter each year. But Rusty changed that. Neighbors checked on Harold because they saw the dog. Store owners remembered conversations because the dog accompanied him. People invited Harold to events because everyone enjoyed seeing Rusty. The dog became a bridge between Harold and the world around him. He talked about that dog constantly, Claire said. Really? Rebecca asked. Claire smiled. Constantly. The room fell silent. Not from sadness, from perspective. For years, the Morgans viewed Buddy's disappearance only through the lens of their own pain. Now they were seeing another side of the story. The years they lost with Buddy had become years that someone else gained. Years that may have helped another person endure loneliness, grief, and aging. That realization didn't erase their loss, but it gave it meaning they never expected. Before leaving the house, Claire handed Rebecca a sealed envelope. I found this in Harold's desk. Rebecca looked confused. For me, not exactly, but I think he would have wanted you to have it. The envelope contained a handwritten letter. The date near the top revealed it had been written approximately 2 years before. Harold died. Nobody spoke as Rebecca read. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone specific. Instead, it appeared to be written for whoever might someday discover Rusty's original family. Harold wrote that he had always suspected the dog belonged to someone. He described how well-trained he was, how gentle he was with children, how comfortable he seemed around families. He admitted that over the years he occasionally considered searching harder for previous owners. But technology was different then. The dog had no collar, no tag, no visible identification, and eventually life simply continued. Near the end of the letter, one passage brought everyone to tears. If somebody is missing this dog, I hope they know he was loved every single day. I may have found him, but I don't think he was ever really mine. I think we just took care of each other for a while. Rebecca had to stop reading. The room blurred through tears. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. Nobody said anything. Nothing needed to be said. Because in a single paragraph, Harold had somehow captured the entire story. A week earlier, he had been a stranger. Now he felt connected to them forever. The next challenge involved bringing Buddy home. Veterinarians conducted extensive examinations. Despite his age, Buddy was healthier than expected. Arthritis, hearing loss, some vision decline, but otherwise remarkably stable. Travel was possible. Carefully planned, but possible. The family decided to drive rather than fly. It would take longer, nearly 22 hours, but it would allow Buddy to travel comfortably. And perhaps more importantly, it would give the family time. Time together. Time they never expected to receive. The journey began on a cool morning beneath a pale Texas sunrise. Buddy rode in the back seat surrounded by blankets. For the first few hours he mostly slept. Occasionally he lifted his head to look outside. Sometimes he watched passing landscapes. Other times he simply listened to familiar voices. Rebecca found herself speaking to him constantly, not because she expected answers, but because 14 years of silence felt impossible to ignore. She told him about Ethan's college graduation, Sophie's nursing career, the homes they had lived in, the holidays he missed, the things that changed, the things that didn't. Daniel laughed at times, cried at others. Even Ethan occasionally shook his head in disbelief. Every few hours someone would look at Buddy and think the same thing. He's really here. When they finally crossed into North Carolina, the emotional weight of the moment became almost overwhelming. The mountains appeared on the horizon. The familiar roads returned. Memories surfaced around every curve. Places where they once searched. Intersections covered with missing dog flyers. Neighborhoods where hope had slowly faded. Now they were driving home with the dog they thought they'd lost forever. Word spread quickly. Friends, neighbors, former classmates, teachers, local businesses. People remembered. Many had participated in the original search years earlier. When the family finally arrived home, several neighbors stood waiting outside. Some cried. Others laughed. Many simply stared in disbelief. The reunion extended beyond the Morgan family. It belonged to an entire community that had once hoped alongside them. Over the following months, Buddy settled into his new life, or perhaps more accurately, his final chapter. There was no sudden return to youth, no miracle transformation. He remained an elderly dog. His walks were shorter, his naps longer, his movements slower. But none of that mattered, because every ordinary day now felt extraordinary. Rebecca often found him sleeping near the kitchen table while she graded papers. Daniel sat with him on quiet evenings watching football. Ethan visited more frequently. Sophie spoiled him with treats approved by his veterinarian. And little by little, the family stopped focusing on the years they lost. Instead, they focused on the time they had. One afternoon several months later, Rebecca climbed into the attic searching for holiday decorations. There she found the old shoebox, the one she had kept for 14 years. Inside was Buddy's original collar, faded, worn, covered in dust. She carried it downstairs. When she showed it to Buddy, he barely reacted. Perhaps he remembered. Perhaps he didn't. There was no way to know. Rebecca smiled anyway, because she finally understood something important. The collar wasn't really what she had been holding onto. It was hope. A tiny piece of hope she never completely abandoned. Even when logic told her otherwise. Even when years passed. Even when life moved forward, hope had remained. Months later, the family organized a small gathering, not to celebrate finding Buddy. Not exactly. They wanted to honor everyone connected to his story. Neighbors attended. Friends attended. Veterinary staff attended. Walter Ramirez traveled from Texas. Claire Benson came too. During the event, they unveiled a simple memorial plaque dedicated to Harold Benson. The inscription contained a single sentence from his letter. "We just took care of each other for a while." People stood quietly reading it. Some cried. Some smiled. Most did both, because they understood what the story had become. Not a story about a missing dog. Not really. It was a story about connection, about the unexpected ways lives intersect, about how love continues traveling long after we think it has reached its destination, about how one dog managed to belong to more than one family without ever replacing either. Nearly a year after the reunion, Buddy passed away peacefully at home. He was surrounded by people who loved him. Rebecca sat beside him. Daniel held his paw. Ethan and Sophie were there too. The grief was real, but it felt different this time. There were no unanswered questions, no uncertainty, no wondering where he was, no imagining what might have happened. Only gratitude. Afterward, the family placed photographs from both chapters of Buddy's life together in a single album. North Carolina, Texas, then North Carolina again. One continuous story, one remarkable journey. Sometimes visitors ask which family Buddy truly belonged to. The Morgans always give the same answer: both. Because the truth is that Buddy's story was never about ownership. It was about love. A little boy and a little girl who grew up with a golden retriever. A lonely widower who found companionship when he needed it most. A rancher who stopped to help a stray dog. Veterinarians who cared enough to scan a microchip. Neighbors who remembered. Strangers who shared information. And a family that never completely stopped helping. 14 years separated loss from reunion. Yet somehow the bond survived. Not because of magic. Not because of miracles. But because sometimes life creates extraordinary outcomes from ordinary acts of kindness. And in the end, that may be the most remarkable part of all. A beloved dog disappeared. People grieved. People changed. Years passed. Then one phone call connected pieces of a story scattered across America. And for a brief, beautiful final chapter, a family got something few people ever receive. Not just a reunion, but the chance to finish a story they thought would remain unfinished forever.